Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here with another YouTube video to help you improve your chess game. One of my students suggested I use one of his games as an example, and he was right, so I thought I would show it to you. There's a series of hope chess issues throughout the game, and hope chess is one of the things that I get misquoted on the most. When I first wrote about the concept of hope chess in my Skittles Room article, The Secrets of Real Chess, in 1999 for Chess Cafe, I didn't mean anything you could hope for in a game of chess. There's lots of things you could hope for. You can make a bad move and hope your opponent doesn't see it. You can make a threat and hope your opponent doesn't meet it. There's lots of things you can hope for. And I didn't mean those things, but a lot of people have given me credit for that, and I guess I should be honored. But that wasn't my original meaning. My original definition of hope chess was when you make a move without looking to see what your opponent could do on the next move in terms of checks, captures, and threats, and whether you could meet such a move on your following move. And if he does make a check, capture, or threat that you didn't anticipate, then you hope you can meet it, because if you can't, if it's an unstoppable threat, then you're just going to fail to that threat, and you can lose. And that's what I meant by hope chess. I didn't mean you threaten somebody's piece and you hope he doesn't see it and you can take it off. But let's take a look at today's game and see that not only does hope chess apply to defensive ideas, like you make a move and you don't see what he can do, and then he does something and you can win material, but it also applies the opposite, which is you make a move and you don't see that you could do something on the following moves and you miss completely your opportunity, and then when it actually comes up, you just hope you could find your opportunity when in fact you should have been looking for it all along. So it actually could work from the defensive side as well, or the offensive side as well as the defensive side. Okay, let me go through the game here. All right, so white opens up e4, black plays e5, knight f3, knight c6. I think this was a slow league game on Lead Chess. I think it might have been 45-45, but I'm not sure. But it was a slow game. And white plays Roy Lopez, black plays what's called the classical variation. All right, so there's basically two big ideas to play against this kind of early bishop c5. You can play what's called the center fork trick with something like knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d4, messing up black center and getting your piece back. You could also do that after you castle. For instance, castle, knight f6, and now knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d4. Or you could play the idea of playing c3 and then d4, and then the bishop has to move away, because you'll have 1, 2, 3 pieces guarding it. He'll have 1, 2, 3 attacking it, which means it's safe, and eventually you'll be able to take back with the pawn on d4. You could also do that first with castles, castle, knight here. You could even play c3 here. You're not too worried about knight takes e4. Or you could stop knight takes e4 first, and then play something like c3 and then d4, when black could play maybe something like bishop b6, although you have to watch out for removal of the guard on the e5 pawn here. Not sure that white will be able to do that, but anyway, what white does in the game is he goes for c3 and d4 right away. And black takes because white's threatening the bishop and he's threatening the e-pawn twice. And now what white should do is he should stop the play e5 so that knight takes e4 is not possible. Instead, he takes back, and after the check, he's got a problem. If he puts the knight in the way, the knight will be pinned and knight takes e4 is possible. And if he puts the bishop in the way, then black can play knight takes e4 right away. In these kind of lines, if white ever plays queen e2, black has a pleasant choice between playing something like queen e7, or maybe d5 first, or maybe even castles with the idea that if queen here, rook here, knight e5, he can attack the knight. Let's see what Stockfish wants to do on queen e2. Mr. Stockfish, what's black's best move? Stockfish says queen e7, and black's just up a pawn. Okay, so back to the game. So here, black should take the pawn. That's the refutation of white not having played e5. Instead, black plays the bad move a6, which gives white an extra tempo to save this pawn, which he does. He could play bishop d3. He could play bishop takes c6. He decides to play bishop takes c6, removing the guard And now black only has one move. He can't take the bishop on c6 because he'll lose the bishop on b4. So he has to play bishop takes d2 check first. But that gives white an opportunity to develop a knight and guard the pawn. Black takes back, d takes c6. So now white has gotten away with it. Black has a bishop for a knight, but he doesn't have the bishop pair because the bishops got traded off. So he doesn't have that extra half pawn bonus for having the bishop pair. And here white is guarding all the pieces. And so white plays castle. Black plays bishop g4. So I just put out a tweet the other day that said, if someone pins the knight to the queen and bishop takes f3 is not a threat, then you should probably play h3 right away to destroy the bishop's flexibility and also make sure you understand what he's really trying to do. Well, here, unfortunately, h3, bishop takes f3 is a threat. Why? Because we've got all these, the safety table says we've got all these things guarded, but when he takes, if you take with the queen, you're losing your d-pawn. And if you take with the knight, then after knight takes e4, again, white can't win the knight with something like rook to e1, because black could temporarily play either f5 or queen d5 and then castle. So bishop takes f3 is somewhat of a threat here. Of course, you'd have to look ahead and figure out whether, after he takes the e-pawn, whether you can win the knight. If you can win the knight, then bishop takes f3 is not a threat. If you can't win the knight, then bishop takes f3 is a threat. But here, bishop takes f3 is a good move for black, so this would not be a good example of where you should play h3 right away. Instead, the engine says the best move is just move out of the pin and play queen b3, hitting the b2 pawn, b7 pawn, sorry. And if bishop takes, you can play knight takes, and now he can't play knight takes here. You can simply pin it. If he plays queen d5, you can play rook takes, queen takes, rook e1. If he plays f5, you can play queen e6 check and just take that pawn right off. For instance, queen e7, queen takes f5, and now the knight is pinned to the queen and the king, and it's attacked twice and only guarded once. So queen b3 is the right move. White plays h3. Black should play bishop takes f3, of course, as we just saw. Instead, he goes back to h5. These little mini tactics make a big difference in how good you are. If you compare these little mini tactics on what goes on between people rated, 20, or rated 1200 or 1100 versus 1600, you'll see a lot of these mini tactics don't take place in the 1600 games, but they do in the 1100 games because the 1100s don't see all these little removal of the guards or capturing sequences. By the way, when you see the name of the white player, Amateur 2021, that's not his rating. That's the year that the game was played. His rating, I'm sure he would love to be rated 2021, but his rating is considerably below that, as you could probably see. Okay, so black plays bishop h5, and white now guards the pawn. Well, that works now, because if bishop takes, now white can play knight takes f3, and everything is safe. So black castles, and now white should develop his pieces. Stockfish suggests queen to b3, and then get the rook in the game through c1 or d1. White plays queen c2, developing the queen. Black develops his rook there. And now Stockfish wants to develop the queen rook to the e file. So he suggests the right sequence is rook to e3, and he says black's best move is rook to b8, and now rook a e1. This is the kind of thing you're striving for. Every one of white's pieces is doing something, and the king is castled. And if you did this, white's advantage would be plus 1.1, and he would have gotten all his pieces into the game by move 15, which is extremely efficient. Usually if you can do it by move 14 or 15, that's great. Sometimes it takes 16, 17, 18 moves to get every piece in the game. That's what should happen, and if white's trying to follow the principles of the opening to get every piece into the game, then he would be doing something like that. At least he would be playing, at the very least, maybe something like rook a c1, although these pawns on the c file aren't much of a target at the moment. Okay, so back to the game. White now plays the bad move e5. A lot of my students like to do stuff like this, and when I ask them why, one of the answers I get is, I'm winning a tempo. Well, you're not winning a tempo. Winning a tempo means you're like developing a piece in the opening and taking it from a square where it's doing nothing into a square where it's doing something, and you're attacking a piece of greater value that has to move away. That's an AWL. And when that piece moves away, it can't move to a square that's any better than where it is now. Well, but moving your pawn from e4 to e5 doesn't develop a piece at all. It doesn't really do much of anything. Well, it does some negative things. It weakens the white squares. But it costs you a tempo, and when black moves the knight to d5, which is an even better square in the middle of the board than it was on f6, then black's knight has become even stronger. So you're actually weakening your pawn structure, you're weakening your white squares, and in doing so, you're forcing the knight to a better square. Well, that's certainly not winning at tempo. So e5 is a candidate move. It's an AWL. I mean, if that trapped the knight and the knight had no moves, well, that would be a great move. But forcing the knight to move to d5 in this position is a really bad idea. Notice in these kind of positions, these two center pawns here on d4, e4 are guarding f5, e5, d5, c5, and black can't put any pieces on those squares. He could put pawns there, of course, if they're guarded, but he can't put pieces there. Once you play e5, then the e pawn is now guarded by the other pawn, but the d pawn is backward here, and the d5 square becomes super weak, as do some of the light squares, and black's the one with the light squared bishop, and you've just made that light squared bishop very nice on this diagonal, as we'll see in a few moves. So e5 is not a good move. And black, of course, plays knight d5. If you look at the evaluation of the position, before white played that move, he's up about one pawn. And after he makes that move and black goes to the center, white's lead has dropped to about 0.2 or so. So he lost 0.8 of a pawn by making this threat. And again, this isn't hope chess. You're not playing e5 and hoping he won't move the knight. That doesn't make any sense. So black plays knight d5, and now it's white's turn. And now white comes up with a really bad idea. He plays queen f5 to attack the bishop. So this is a little bit of hope chess, because if you're going to attack that bishop, you would never do it without saying, how's he going to save the bishop? Because if he can't, then it's a tactic and you're winning the bishop, and it's a really good move. But if he can, and he's actually improving his position by doing so, then you're really not doing much. And here, black has kind of a mini tactic here. In saving the bishop and attacking the queen, which of course is what he would do, now he's starting to get ideas of bringing the knight into d3 and c2. So you're actually giving your opponent somewhat of a tactic here. And in doing so, you have to look ahead and see if he has checks, captures, and threats that you can't meet. Well, it turns out if you figure this out really cleverly, queen to g4 just barely avoids all these tactics. But both sides are kind of blissfully unaware of what's going on here. And white just says to himself the kind of hand-waving idea, oh, I've been doing well in endgames lately. My opponents aren't very good in endgames. Let's offer the trade of queens, and we'll get into an endgame. And the problem is, if you play queen to g5, which is what white played, without looking at black's checks, captures, and threats, then black can play a capture, queen takes, knight takes, and now a threat. And his threats to come in here are pretty much unstoppable. For instance, suppose white plays, I don't know, rook on a to d1 to avoid the fork. Then after knight c2, black's just going to be able to fork the rook and the pawn, because white can't play rook to e4 to guard it, so you're losing a pawn. Let's say he moves the other rook. Well, no matter where he moves it, let's say rook to d1, you still have knight here, and if rook saves himself, then knight takes d4. Unstoppable ways of winning material here. So, in a sense, white's playing both queen f5 and queen g5 are forms of hope chess. They're also hand-waving, because white's not analyzing the position. He's just generalizing that he wants to trade queens without actually analyzing that he has no defense against knight to b4, which is a threat. So what black should do here is trade queens and then play knight b4. Well, black sees the knight b4 idea, but he doesn't calculate it correctly, and he plays knight b4 first, which is not quite as accurate. Black is still much better, of course. So white plays the move that he has not much better, is to play queen takes, rook takes. And now the fact that the knight is guarding this pawn is not as important, because now when the knight forks, the second piece will be attacking that pawn, and there's no defense against losing that pawn. All right, so here White tries to guard against the fork with rook on e to c1, and now black can simply play knight c2, and on rook b1, saving the exchange, he can play knight takes d4 with a discovered attack on the rook. And the engine says if black does that, he's up like the equivalent of 5 pawns. Knight here, rook here, knight here, hitting the rook again. If the rook goes away, then the knight forks over here. So white's just losing the exchange and a pawn. The game would be over. But instead, black goes for the other fork, and he plays the bad move, knight to d3. All right, again, this is a little bit of offensive hope chess, because he's not really calculating what white should do. If he did, he'd realize this doesn't work, because what white has now is he has rook to c3, and if knight takes b2, then rook b3 double attacks the pawn and the knight, and white gets his pawn back, and he has an even position. So if we look at the evaluation, let's bring the evaluation up so you can look at it with me. If he plays knight c2, he's up by 5 pawns. If he plays knight d3 and white finds rook c3, black's lead is all the way down to about 1 pawn. And further, if he thinks he can get away with taking the pawn, which he can, and then rook b3, now actually white has a microscopic advantage. So knight to d3 is, if you calculate, is much, much worse than knight to c2. All right, so here black plays knight there, and now white should calculate, oh, he's forking my rook and my pawn. What are all the ways to save my rook? And he should calculate which ones are the best. He can't really guard the pawn. If he tries to play rook f here, it's true if black now plays a discovered attack, he's only threatening to win the exchange, and that would be a monster mistake, because white could play pawn takes, and if bishop takes, rook takes, he's won a rook and a pawn for 2 pieces, or I should say white has won 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn, and you can see white's completely winning here. If you go by Reinfeld numbers and you say, oh, black has a rook and a pawn versus 2 knights, rook and a pawn is equal to 2 knights, black's doing fine. Well, this is where the Reinfeld numbers are going to lie to you, and they're going to say the game's about even, when in fact 2 pieces are almost always worth a lot more than a rook and a pawn. And here is no exception, plus 2.3. So white could try that. Instead, what he did was he plays rook to c2. Well, that's even worse, because now the rook's not guarded. So now knight takes e5 will work, because you get a whole rook, not the exchange. And that's what black does, and white says, whoops, I can't take the knight because he'll take my rook, so he saves the rook, and now he's just lost the pawn. All right, so black says, I'll go back knight d3 again. The engine says, no, you're winning. Just trade off when you're winning. Knight takes f3, you're up 3.5. It's amazing how lower-rated players don't follow these general ideas of what you do when you're winning. When you're winning, trade pieces, not necessarily pawns. A lot of people, when I ask them, what should you do when you're winning, they say, trade pieces, not pawns. Well, not pawns and not necessarily pawns is not a small difference. It's a gigantic difference in meaning. Not pawns means you shouldn't trade pawns when you're winning. Well, that's not true. There's some positions where you're winning where if you don't trade pawns, you can't win. There's other positions where you're winning, and if you trade pawns, you also can't win. So there's some positions where not trading pawns costs you the win, and there's other positions where trading pawns costs you the win. So there's no rule that says when you're winning, make fair trades of pieces, not pawns. The rule is that pawns aren't really involved. So that's why you say when you're winning, make fair trades of pieces, not necessarily pawns. I've had people argue with me that, oh, not pawns and not necessarily pawns, that's a nuance. And the answer is no, it's a gigantic difference in meaning. Maybe it's a nuance in terms of how the words come out of your mouth because they're similar words, but the meaning of them is tremendously different. Okay, so back to the game, knight to d3, hitting the b2 pawn. White saves it by pushing it, maybe not the best way to save it. The engine suggests knight c4, but it says white's down a pawn for no compensation anyway, so white's losing no matter what he plays. Black brings the knight back there. Notice black likes to make threats, and again, this isn't really, it's not like, that's not my definition of hope chess. This isn't where black is hoping white doesn't see it. Maybe he is hoping that white doesn't see it, but I don't call that hope chess. That's just making a threat, and if you're also hoping that white doesn't see it, that's fine, but that was never my definition. people give me credit for saying, oh, black's hoping he can do this even though white can stop him. That's hope chess. Never what I meant, but if you want to say that, okay, well, maybe he is hoping that white doesn't see this, but that doesn't mean that was my original definition. Okay, back to the game. So white says, I see it, I don't want to trade, but I really don't have any choice here. You're threatening to do all kinds of things to me. Black checks, and now he's threatening to pick up the pawn, but he's not really threatening it. Why not? Again, this is basic tactics. Well, if white attacks the knight and black plays knight takes, the rook on d8 is overworked. He's got an overworked rook. So white could do one of two things. He can take the knight, and now black can't get his piece back, because if he takes the knight, he gets checkmated. And if he takes the rook first, then white could take with the pawn and guard the knight. Or white could do it in the opposite direction. He could play rook takes rook first, forcing rook takes rook, and then play knight takes knight, and if the rook skewers the knights, he can just use a knight to guard the other knight, and he gets away with the extra piece. So, because of that overworked piece tactic, after king f1, black does not have knight takes d4, but of course he can always move the knight back to f4. So in the game, black plays knight g3 check. And again, this is a good chance for me to say, this is not my definition of hope chess. You know, black's not hoping that white takes the knight so he could take the rook. I mean, maybe he is hoping that. But the answer is, yeah, I mean, white's going to see this. It's when you play a move like knight g3 check, you're pretty much telling your opponent, hey, I'm putting my knight and take to the pawn. I bet you can't take it because that's the only reason I would do that. So you're kind of telling him not to take the knight with the pawn. You would, if you're white, of course, and you're not a good player, you would certainly look at taking the knight with the pawn, but then you'd realize, oh, if I take that, he's like enticing me to do this. So again, not hope chess, but could black be hoping that white is going to take the knight? He can hope it, but you'd have to have a very weak opponent who's actually going to do it. So white says, sure, I'll just repeat the position. And now at this point, black should kind of give up and get the knight out of there, or maybe check and bring the knight back to f4. He trades rooks first. White takes with the pawn. White's still down a pawn for no compensation. Black hits the pawn on e3. White guards it, hits the knight. Black says, good, I'm up a pawn, let's trade pieces. Knight takes, bishop takes. All right, in this position, bishop takes knight probably isn't really a big threat, even though you want to trade pieces when you're ahead, because rook and pawn endgames are relatively difficult to win when you're up a pawn. It's probably easier to win with the bishop and the rook against the knight. White still avoids the trade, which is okay. Black plays bishop to d3. White gets his rook behind the pawn. Black plays rook e6. White plays there. And now notice this bishop is starting to run out of moves. So black should play a move that gives this bishop some squares. Maybe like a5 so the bishop can rest on a6. Instead, black is oblivious and he forces white to win the game with rook f6 check. And now what white should do is calculate. All right, I could play king g1, I could play king at g3, I could play knight f3, I can play king e3. King e3 looks good. I'm in the middle, I'm attacking the bishop, and the bishop is loose. Where would he go? Well, gee, if he goes to b5, I can play a4, and he's trapped. If he goes to c2, my only move that attacks that is rook c1, and that's trapped. So at this point in the game, if white's not playing hope chess and he's trying to figure out what's going on, he would calculate, oh, among all the ways to get out of check, king e3 wins the bishop, so that's the best way to get out of check. Well, white does play king e3, but he's just playing it on general principles that he wants to go to the middle and attack the bishop. He's not actually calculating whether or not the bishop's trapped, which of course pretty much every good player in the world would do that before playing king e3. And now black tries to save the bishop with bishop c2. We already saw that bishop b5, a4 leaves it trapped. And now white should just say, oh, that bishop has no squares. What happens if I attack it again? Well, the only move that attacks it again is rook c1, and the bishop's trapped. So here white just has to use the seeds of tactical destruction. If you don't know what that is, I have an earlier video. It's things wrong with somebody's position that tell you might have a tactic. And here what's wrong with black's position is he has a loose bishop, and it doesn't have any good squares to go to. So rook c1 is an obvious move winning the game. Instead, white, for the second time in the game, plays a bad move, e5. It's the second e5 bad move. This is the second time he's attacked the piece on f6 with the pawn that's been bad. In both cases, he's weakened the squares and he's forced the piece to a better square, but in this case, he's also given the bishop places to save itself now. So here, black could just play rook here, and on rook c1, play bishop g6. Instead, black plays rook to g6, hitting this pawn. And now, if rook to c1, then bishop to f5. So white plays g4, saving the pawn. But this is like my earlier video, just because it's forced. Just because white had to save the pawn doesn't mean it doesn't do something else. And what it does is it stops the bishop from going back to f5. So it actually threatens rook c1 again. So what black should do is play rook h6, hit this pawn, and when white saves the pawn, that would give the bishop a place to go. But black's completely oblivious to the fact that this pawn move has threatened his bishop, and he simply moves his king toward the middle, and by now white finally realizes, oh look, I'm lucky. I gave him all these squares, but he didn't realize what was going on, and now he traps the bishop. And now he has to sack the bishop, and now white's up a piece. We'll go a little faster now. White says, oh look, I can win these queenside pawns. And he does. Knight checks, wins another one. Now white should just put his knight back on c5. Push the a pawn. Push the e pawn. If he has to, put his rook behind his a pawn. Push it up the board. And one of the black pieces is going to have to go over here and stop the a pawn. I mean, he can put the rook behind it, but after rook here, whoops, didn't mean to do that. After rook to h6, a4, rook to h3, white can just play rook to a1 and put the rook behind the pawn and start pushing it. And now, if the black king gets behind the pawn, you just push your pawn in with the king helping it, and you win easily. All right, so let's go back to the game. So in the game, white gets a little greedy and goes after this pawn, but that's not the right idea. So it's going to take him a lot longer to win this way, but he's still winning pretty easily. Finally, he takes the pawn. Black goes there. White tries to come up. Black keeps going behind. Rooks belong behind past pawns. White didn't do that. Now white blocks his king's way to come into the game. That wasn't a very good thing. He wants to bring his king in. He doesn't want to do what he did and block the line. He's still winning easily, but he's making it harder and harder. Rook there. Notice the rook here is overworked. He has to guard both pawns and guard the knight, and meanwhile the king has trouble coming in. So white's got to figure out how to win this. It's not that hard, but it's a lot harder than it was. He figures, let's move the knight around and do something. He trades pawns, which in this case is okay, but he doesn't want to trade too many. And he's trying to maneuver his king and his knight around to hit the g6 pawn. Probably I would have played king e5, king f6 there. And now white has a mate. King up. And there's going to be a mate coming up very quickly. For instance, king here, knight check, king here, rook mates. There's other mates too. So he has a mate. He just takes the pawn, which wins easily also. Rook hits the pawn. The king comes up so the rook can guard both pawns. The king goes up to hit the knight, and the knight forks the king and the rook. That's our last hope chess. Black says, I'll just attack the knight, and he doesn't look at white's checks, captures, and threats. Of course, white has a check that wins the rook. So that's a really easy example of hope chess. The difference is here, black's dead lost anyway. This just takes him out of his misery. Okay, thanks for watching the game today. I hope you learned something. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you could do it. You could also like the video, but the best thing you can do is tell your friends about the channel, Dan Heisman Chess. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.